WBUR Podcasts, Boston.
I'm Daryl C. Murphy, and you're listening to The Common. Rohit Acharya, partner at Common Good Labs. Thank you for coming through to The Common.
Thank you so much for having me here.
So, Rohit, you and your partner at Common Good Labs, which is a data science firm, authored a report for the Brookings Institution that found nearly 200 neighborhoods in America managed to reduce poverty without displacing the local community. I learned about this report in a piece from Boston Globe's David Scharfenberg that focused on how Boston's very own Upham's Corner is among these neighborhoods. Rohit, I'm very excited to talk with you about this, but I want to begin with a little introduction of the neighborhood. So, tell us a little bit about Upham's Corner.
Sure. So Upham's Corner is a neighborhood in Dorchester in Boston. It is a really dynamic community, a very tight-knit community, and a community that a lot of people may not know much about. The residents there are primarily from Cape Verde and the Dominican Republic. About 35% of the people who live there are foreign-born, and it has a lot of really historic institutions such as the Strand Theater, which is probably the centerpiece of the community. It has seen some tougher days, especially in the mid-century through white flight from Boston. The community fell into disrepair, but in the last 20, 30 years, it has bounced back from being a community that I think people associate with a lot of the ills of urban disrepair to a very vibrant community that I think is worth talking about today.
Before we jump into Upham's Corner and how it got to where it's at, what exactly were you looking for with this report?
What we wanted to do in our report was identify neighborhoods that were able to reduce poverty, but not displace the people who lived in those neighborhoods. And so I think when people think of poor neighborhoods, everybody's afraid of gentrification. And I think people associate gentrification with a lot of people who are not from that neighborhood moving in, predominantly very wealthy, completely changing the nature of the neighborhood. And then the people who are living in that neighborhood get pushed out. And so when we talk about reducing poverty without displacement, we're talking about two things simultaneously. One is how do we reduce poverty in high poverty neighborhoods, which we define by more than 30% of the population living below the poverty threshold. So we wanted to identify neighborhoods that were able to significantly drop the poverty rate, but at the same time do so without having the people who live there actually be pushed out, meaning that the neighborhood itself was able to become wealthier with the people still living there. And this is, in some ways, can seem like a tightrope walk for a lot of communities. How do you do both simultaneously? But in our report, we were able to find 200 communities around the country that successfully pulled this off from 2000 to 2015.
And that's the case for Upham's Corner and several communities across the country. How were they able to pull this off?
So in our report, what we set out to do was identify what commonalities did these neighborhoods share. And what we found was that there were 8 indicators. We split these indicators into 2 different groups. One was external indicators and one was internal indicators. The external indicators are what conditions are around the community that set the basis for success. And so what we found there was positive economic growth in the region, low homicide rates, and low risks of displacement from adjacent communities. These communities that we looked at, these 200 or so communities, about 95% of them shared all 3 of these indicators, including Upham's Corner. Then when we move to internal indicators, these are indicators that the neighborhoods shared that they could control. And those were high rates of home ownership, low rates of residential vacancy, increased housing, greater rates of self-employment, and the presence of community building organizations. And what we saw is that these communities did not necessarily have to have all 5 of these internal indicators, but a large proportion of them shared at least 3 or more of these.
Mm-hmm.
And in the case of Upham's Corner, what we found, 2 of these indicators really shined. And they were the increases in housing density from 1990 to 2000, and also the presence of community building organizations.
So if a community has all these factors in place, these indicators, what's the likelihood they'll have success?
So what we saw in our research was that of all high poverty neighborhoods, if a community was missing one of the external indicators, they had less than a 2% chance of being a neighborhood that reduced poverty without displacement. But if you had all of these indicators, it went up to 17%. That just goes to show that there are no silver bullets. However, we want to provide the right environment for these communities to succeed. And 17% is a whole lot better than 2%.
We're going to take a quick break, but we'll be right back.
Did you kill Marlene Johnson?
I think you're one of the first people to have actually asked.
From WBUR and ZSP Media, this is Beyond All Repair, a new podcast about an unsolved murder that will leave you questioning everything.
Somebody should be in jail for murdering my sister.
A woman who's never been believed.
As long as they think I have done this, then they're not looking for who actually did this.
And that's what makes it a cold case.
No, it's a botched case.
And a search for the truth, once and for all.
Wow, it just gets more interesting.
Beyond All Repair. Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
Be careful. You're digging in a place that's been very peaceful for a while.
Do it anyway. Dig.
And we're back. How do you measure when a community is, reducing its poverty and people are able to stay over time?
We looked at it a few different ways, but the first thing that we looked at was from a poverty reduction perspective. We said we wanted to find neighborhoods that reduced it by at least 10%. So that means if you had 35% of the population in poverty, you had to get down to 25%, which is a significant change. So the second angle we wanted to look at was the displacement factor. We did this by looking at a couple of metrics. The first was look at the community composition, the racial and ethnic composition, and see if that stayed consistent. Second, we looked at communities where the population grew. We want to look at neighborhoods where people were staying in the neighborhood, that the poverty reduction was not happening because the neighborhood was shrinking.
And just to be clear, are we talking about communities where the same people are staying for long periods of time, or where people of the same race, but with more money, are moving into the neighborhood and displacing former residents?
That's a great question. In our study, we looked at both the racial composition of the neighborhood, but realized that that wasn't enough because there could be circumstances, as you said, where people of the same race are moving in, but have more wealth. In order to get a better sense of if we were talking about the same people living in that community staying, we looked at 2 different things. One was resident retention. What percentage of the population actually had lived in the community and stayed in the community throughout the course of our research? And the second thing was looking at the income distribution. What we find in communities that are displacing is that you tend to see a lot of people who are poor, but if you look at the income distribution, you tend to see a lot of people who may make over $100,000. And so you almost see 2 distinct groups in the distribution. But in Upham's Corner and other communities like Upham's Corner, what we see is over the course of our period of the study is that you see a gradual increase of income, which is a more organic increase in the income of the people who live there. And for us, that plus the resident retention plus the racial composition is a good indicator that we are talking about the community being the same, and at least that the cultural aspect of the community is staying the same. On top of all of this, we also did a lot of on-the-ground research with these communities to see, hey, the data can tell you one thing, but sometimes you got to see it with your own eyes. And I think that's one thing that David Scharfenberg got right in the Boston Globe article, is that through his research on the ground, the story that we found in the data was also represented with his conversations with residents there.
How do the findings of this report challenge the way our society handles poverty?
The number one thing that we want to convey with our report is that positive change is possible. There is a lot of negativity around what can and can not be done with poverty in this country. And I think that for us, it was really important to show that there are examples that we can look to of communities that have reduced poverty without displacing its local residents. And so the message of positivity is top of mind. But the second thing is then to say there are things that can be done that local leaders, nonprofits, business executives, community organizers can do to enact change. And since there are so many different parties involved with urban revitalization, poverty eradication, all these different things, it was important for us to say, let's narrow it down to a set of factors that people can grasp and really tighten the conversations, because we don't have endless time. We don't have endless resources. And I think for us, the data is really useful for sifting the answers and identifying potential ways to improve.
How can communities replicate this success for themselves? What should they look for as far as recognizing indicators? And if they don't have these indicators, is there a way that they can acquire them?
These indicators can be tracked regardless of whether you're a high poverty neighborhood or not, whether you have them in place or not. And so I think for these neighborhoods, these 8 indicators are barometers in order to just say, what is the temperature of this neighborhood? How is this neighborhood trending? And I think that's the first step, is really putting a stake in the sand and saying, where are we trending? What do we look like today? And in order to do that, there is a ton of data that is available and public. In fact, all of the data that we use for our report came from public sources. And so there is a lot of data that can be compiled to say, this is giving an idea of how your neighborhood is trending. From there, the policy recommendations can follow. Once you take that data, you listen to the stories on the ground, it becomes very clear at what may make sense for a particular neighborhood. For example, a neighborhood in an urban area may not be able to pursue home ownership as easily because of high housing prices, but they may have a much easier time being able to set up a community development organization. So it is important to set up the indicators, to see the trends, and then from there make the right choices thereafter.
Rohit, thank you so much for talking to us at The Common. This is fascinating to me, so I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me here, Daryl.
That's partner at Common Good Labs, Rohit Acharya. And that's our show for today. Thank you so much for listening to The Common. If you have any thoughts you'd like to share on development without displacement, hit us up on Instagram at WBUR The Common, or send us an email at thecommon@wbur.org. I'm Daryl C. Murphy, and I will talk to you tomorrow.